I always knew they were watching, but I never imagined they'd go this far. Not diplomacy, not pressure, not sanctions. This time, Israel sent shadows into my soil, unmarked faces, satellite intercepts, encrypted drones, bribes funneled through third parties. They called it intelligence gathering. I call it a declaration of war. When my Minister of Internal Security slid the file across my desk, I didn't flinch. I opened it like I was reading a death certificate because, in some ways, I was. A death certificate for trust, for diplomacy, for whatever was left of normal relations between Burkina Faso and the Israeli state. Inside that manila envelope were photographs, wiretaps, transaction receipts, an entire covert operation orchestrated under Netanyahu's command right here, in my capital. I looked at the final page. It read, in bold black ink, Operation Dust Pan, Objective, Neutralize Pan-African Realignment. That was me. I was the realignment. And Netanyahu had just crossed the red line. He didn't just spy on a leader, he tried to infiltrate a revolution. And now, the world will hear my answer. The intelligence file was thicker than any document I had ever received as president. 347 pages of meticulously documented evidence that laid bare the scope of Israeli surveillance operations on Burkina Faso soil. Each page told a story of violation, of sovereignty trampled underfoot by operatives who believed African nations existed for their convenience and exploitation. The photographs were the most disturbing element. High-resolution images taken from impossible angles, clearly captured by surveillance equipment far more sophisticated than anything our security services possessed. Pictures of private meetings in government buildings, shots taken through windows of my personal residence, facial recognition scans of my family members going about their daily lives. The message was unmistakable. We can see everything, we can reach everyone, nowhere is safe from our oversight. But the wiretaps revealed the true extent of their ambitions. Hours of recorded conversations between my ministers, captured through compromised communication systems that we had believed were secure. Discussions about policy decisions, strategic planning sessions, even personal conversations about family matters and health concerns. They had violated not just our governmental processes, but our basic human dignity. The transaction receipts told perhaps the most damaging story of all. A complex web of financial transfers that showed how Israeli intelligence had systematically corrupted elements within our society. Payments to local officials for access to restricted areas, bribes to telecommunications workers for installing surveillance equipment, compensation to former military officers for providing intelligence about our security protocols. They had created a shadow network of assets and informants that operated in parallel to our legitimate government structures. Most chilling was the discovery of how long this operation had been running. The oldest documents in the file dated back 18 months, to just weeks after our announcement of the Saudi-Pakistan alliance. They had been watching us, infiltrating us, mapping our weaknesses and vulnerabilities from the very beginning of our independence-minded policies. Every decision we made, every strategy we developed, every relationship we built, all of it had been monitored, analyzed, and reported back to Tel Aviv in real time. The operational scope was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its implications. They hadn't just placed a few spies in our capital, they had constructed an entire intelligence architecture designed to monitor and manipulate our government's functioning. Communication intercepts, financial surveillance, behavioral analysis, predictive modeling of our policy decisions. They knew what we were going to do before we knew it ourselves. But what made the operation truly insidious was its integration with seemingly legitimate activities. Israeli technology companies had provided our government with cybersecurity software that contained hidden backdoors. Agricultural advisors had installed monitoring equipment in rural areas under the guise of crop optimization programs. Medical assistance programs had been used as cover for biometric data collection and population surveillance. It started with whispers, unusual foreign advisors showing up at hotels with no agenda, technology contracts that vanished after signing, unmarked diplomatic crates arriving in the dead of night. We were rebuilding, laying roads, repaving trade routes, printing schoolbooks that told our truth, not colonial lies. And suddenly, everything seemed to stall. The pattern had been so subtle that it took months for our security services to recognize it as systematic sabotage rather than random technical failures. Each incident appeared isolated, explainable through normal bureaucratic incompetence or infrastructure limitations. A power grid failure here, a communication disruption there, a transportation delay somewhere else. But when analyzed collectively, they revealed a deliberate campaign to disrupt our development initiatives and create an atmosphere of dysfunction and unreliability. The Israeli operatives had studied our systems with scholarly thoroughness, identifying precisely which components to target for maximum disruption with minimum detectability. They understood that a dramatic attack would unite our population against foreign interference, but slow degradation of essential services would create frustration and political instability that could be exploited through local proxies. Satellites overhead began rerouting. A key power substation failed for unknown reasons. A fiber optic link between ministries went dark for 3 days. We thought it was sabotage. Turns out, it was surveillance. Israeli cyber units had deployed malware through compromised aid organizations. They hacked our government's internal server, then cloaked the data trail using servers based in Ghana and Cyprus. This wasn't just curiosity. This was war-level espionage. The cyber operations were particularly sophisticated, utilizing attack vectors that suggested access to cutting-edge intelligence tools normally reserved for major military conflicts. The malware they deployed was modular, designed to adapt to different systems and maintain persistence, even through security updates and hardware replacements. Most disturbing was its capability for real-time data exfiltration. They weren't just stealing information, they were creating a live feed of our governmental operations. The routing through third countries revealed the international scope of their intelligence infrastructure. Ghana and Cyprus weren't just convenient relay points, they were integral components of a global surveillance network that allowed Israeli intelligence to monitor African governments while maintaining plausible deniability. If their operations were discovered, they could claim the attacks originated from other countries, complicating any response and providing diplomatic cover. But the use of aid organizations as attack vectors represented a particularly cynical violation of international norms. Organizations providing humanitarian assistance are supposed to operate under special protections, their work considered too vital to be compromised by intelligence operations. By weaponizing humanitarian aid, Israeli intelligence had violated fundamental principles that govern civilized relations between nations. And when I traced the funding, all roads led to Netanyahu's desk. The financial architecture supporting these operations was complex, involving multiple shell companies, cryptocurrency transactions, and offshore banking arrangements. But the ultimate authorization came from the highest levels of the Israeli government. This wasn't a rogue operation or lower-level initiative, it was a deliberate policy decision made by Israel's political leadership. The funding trail revealed the true cost of their surveillance operation, over $40 million spent over 18 months. This wasn't casual intelligence gathering, it was a major investment in destabilizing our government. The resources allocated suggested they viewed our independence-minded policies as a serious threat, requiring sustained, professional response. More troubling was the discovery that similar funding streams had been directed toward other African countries that had shown signs of challenging Western hegemony. Mali, Niger, Chad, and several other Sahel nations had been targeted for varying levels of surveillance and disruption. We weren't an isolated target, we were part of a broader campaign to prevent African unity and independence. I didn't go public, not yet. First I gathered proof. Every intercepted email, every drone frequency we jammed, every fake NGO they used as a cover. Then, I made a decision. If Netanyahu wanted a shadow war, I'd bring it into the light. The decision to expose the operation required careful calculation of risks and benefits. Going public would certainly trigger retaliation, potentially including more aggressive forms of destabilization, but remaining silent would allow the operation to continue and potentially expand, while sending a message to other potential targets that such violations could be conducted without consequences. The evidence-gathering process took weeks of careful analysis by our best intelligence professionals, assisted by technical experts from allied nations who helped verify the authenticity of digital evidence and trace the operational networks. We needed documentation that would be credible to international audiences, not just compelling to those already sympathetic to our position. The psychological pressure during this period was intense. Knowing that every conversation might be monitored, every decision analyzed, every movement tracked created an atmosphere of paranoia that threatened to paralyze our government's functioning. Ministers began second-guessing routine communications, staff became suspicious of new colleagues, and the basic trust necessary for effective governance began to erode. But we also used this knowledge strategically, feeding false information through channels we knew were compromised, tracking how that information was processed and disseminated, and gradually mapping the full scope of their operational network. We turned their surveillance apparatus into an intelligence source about their own capabilities and intentions. So I called the press, not just local. I summoned Al Jazeera, TRT, CCTV Africa, Press TV, even reluctant outlets from France and Germany. I handed them the evidence myself, live, unfiltered. And I said one sentence: Burkina Faso has been violated by an ally in peacetime, by a regime that fears African independence more than it fears war. The press conference was unlike anything in modern African diplomatic history. Rather than making vague accusations or relying on second-hand sources, we presented primary documentation that proved our claims beyond reasonable doubt. The journalists in attendance, initially skeptical about such serious accusations against a Western ally, found themselves confronted with evidence too comprehensive to dismiss. The reaction was immediate and electric. Within hours, the story was trending globally on social media platforms, with the hashtag number Burkina Betrayed spreading across multiple languages and continents. African social media exploded with expressions of solidarity and outrage, while international audiences struggled to process the implications of such systematic surveillance of a sovereign nation. But the most significant response came from other African governments, who began quietly reaching out to share their own suspicions about unusual technical problems and security breaches that had previously been attributed to local factors. The revelation that Israel was conducting systematic surveillance operations across Africa sparked a continental conversation about technological sovereignty and foreign interference. It went viral in hours, but that wasn't the real message. The real message came 24 hours later, when I stood in front of the National Assembly and made it clear: we will not be your experiment. We will not be your proxy. We will not be your colony. I declared the permanent expulsion of all Israeli diplomatic staff. I gave their security liaisons 72 hours to leave. I canceled $210 million in defense contracts with Israeli tech firms. And I froze all intelligence sharing. Burkina Faso was cutting the cord. The National Assembly session was broadcast live across Africa, watched by millions who had never seen an African leader so directly and comprehensively reject foreign interference. The symbolism was powerful. An African parliament, filled with representatives elected by African people, making sovereign decisions about African interests without seeking permission from former colonial powers or their allies. The expulsion of diplomatic staff was particularly significant because it demonstrated that we were prepared to accept the consequences of our actions. Diplomatic relations are the foundation of international engagement, and severing them represents a fundamental break that cannot easily be repaired. We were choosing dignity over convenience, sovereignty over security cooperation. The cancellation of defense contracts sent shockwaves through the Israeli military-industrial complex and served notice to other African governments about the economic leverage they possessed. Israel's defense industry depended heavily on African customers who provided both revenue and testing grounds for new technologies. Our rejection of their contracts would cost Israeli companies hundreds of millions in lost revenue and damage their reputation across the continent. But perhaps most importantly, the freezing of intelligence sharing demonstrated that we understood the true nature of these relationships. Intelligence cooperation is never truly reciprocal. It always flows primarily toward the more powerful partner, providing them with insight into the weaker partner's decision-making processes, vulnerabilities, and strategic thinking. By ending these arrangements, we were choosing ignorance over infiltration. And Netanyahu? He didn't blink. Instead, he tried to double down. 2 days later, anonymous sources leaked to Western press outlets that Burkina Faso is harboring extremist elements. Classic smear campaign. Then came cyber attacks, ministry websites taken offline, fake statements released in my name, even my personal phone bombarded with spyware attempts traced back to an Israeli-made Pegasus variant. The retaliation campaign revealed the true nature of Israeli intelligence capabilities and their willingness to use them against African nations that refused to submit to their oversight. The cyber attacks were particularly sophisticated, targeting not just government systems, but also civilian infrastructure that supported our economy and society. The fake statements released in my name were designed to create confusion and undermine my credibility, both domestically and internationally. They included fabricated policy announcements, false diplomatic communications, and manufactured controversy designed to create political crises that would distract from the surveillance revelations. The Pegasus spyware attacks represented a particularly personal violation, targeting not just my official communications but my private devices used for family communications and personal matters. The psychological impact was as important as the intelligence value. They wanted me to know that nowhere was safe from their oversight, that privacy was an illusion they could shatter at will. But I was ready, because while they were watching us, we were watching them too. Our intelligence caught an Israeli contractor trying to pose as a telecom advisor. We intercepted footage of meetings held in Côte d'Ivoire, where Netanyahu's envoys tried bribing ex-generals to destabilize the Sahel region. And then came the final insult. An Israeli surveillance balloon entered our airspace unmarked, high altitude, with real-time transmission capabilities. We shot it down, recovered the drives, and confirmed everything. Netanyahu was not gathering intelligence. He was planning preemptive disruption. The surveillance balloon incident marked a qualitative escalation that crossed from covert operations into potential acts of war. Violating national airspace with military surveillance equipment represents a fundamental breach of sovereignty that justifies defensive action under international law. Our decision to shoot down the balloon sent an unmistakable message. We would defend our territorial integrity against any intrusion. The recovery of the surveillance equipment provided the final pieces of evidence needed to prove the systematic nature of Israeli operations. The drives contained detailed maps of our military installations, communication networks, and critical infrastructure. But they also contained operational plans for potential sabotage activities, including detailed targeting assessments for power generation facilities, water treatment plants, and transportation networks. Most disturbing were the psychological profiles they had compiled on key government officials, military commanders, and civil society leaders. These profiles included personal vulnerabilities, family relationships, financial circumstances, and behavioral patterns that could be exploited for blackmail or manipulation. They had created a comprehensive target list for potential coercion operations. Within 48 hours, African leaders began reaching out. Mali, Chad, Guinea, Congo, Sudan, Ethiopia. Some were shocked. Others nodded in quiet understanding. Finally, one president told me, "Someone said it." The African Union called an emergency closed-door session. I stood in front of 44 delegates, held up the declassified files, and said, "If they can do this to me, they can do it to any of you. This isn't about Burkina Faso. This is about sovereignty and black skin." The African Union session represented a watershed moment in continental politics, the first time that systematic foreign surveillance had been addressed as a collective threat requiring coordinated response. The evidence we presented sparked immediate demands for technical assistance from other member states who wanted to assess their own vulnerability to similar operations. The phrase sovereignty and black skin resonated across the continent because it captured the racial dimension of these operations that many had felt but few had articulated. The assumption that African governments could be surveilled, manipulated, and controlled with impunity reflected deep-seated racist attitudes about African capability and legitimacy that had persisted long after formal decolonization. That night, 6 African nations froze their defense procurement talks with Israel, and the Arab League issued a rare statement backing Burkina Faso's right to defend its sovereignty from technological warfare. Meanwhile, Netanyahu's government denied everything. They called it a hoax, said it was manipulated data from hostile actors. But we had timestamps, metadata, radio frequencies, blockchain trails. Truth doesn't need to scream. It only needs to be shown. The coordinated response from multiple African governments demonstrated that our revelation had catalyzed a broader movement toward technological sovereignty and resistance to foreign interference. The freezing of defense contracts represented billions in lost revenue for Israeli companies and sent a clear message about the economic consequences of violating African sovereignty. The Arab League statement was particularly significant because it represented solidarity between Arab and African nations against Israeli interference, potentially reshaping Middle Eastern and African relationships in ways that challenged traditional Western-dominated frameworks. So now, Mr. Netanyahu, let me speak directly to you since you clearly care so much about what happens in Burkina Faso. You underestimated something profound. You thought you were dealing with a man, but you were dealing with a movement. You thought you were surveilling a government, but you were surveilling a generation. I am not your puppet. Burkina Faso is not your satellite. Africa is not your backdoor battlefield. We are not anti-Semitic. We are not warmongers. We are not looking for enemies. But we will not bow. If you believe Africa can be bullied into submission by spyware, contracts, and fake diplomacy, You are decades behind the times. We are no longer asking for respect. We are demanding it. And if your response is escalation, then know this. We've built a new Africa where dignity is our firewall. And no spyware can breach the soul of a people who have chosen freedom over fear. To every nation watching, this is no longer a dispute between Burkina Faso and Israel. This is a test of how far Africa has come. We will not be silent. We will not be silenced. This continent has fed the world, built its cities, mined its riches. Now we reclaim something even more valuable, our voice. And if that terrifies those who once ruled us, then perhaps they were never ready for a free Africa in the first place. Let them spy, let them scheme. We have seen their playbook, and now we write our own. Country or death, dignity or nothing. Africa will rise. The aftermath of our revelations created ripple effects that neither we nor our adversaries had fully anticipated. Within 72 hours of the press conference, our secure communication channels were overwhelmed with messages from across the global south. Presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, and intelligence chiefs from nations spanning 3 continents reached out with variations of the same urgent question. How do we know if they're doing this to us too? The hunger for technological sovereignty that our actions had revealed was staggering in its scope. Countries that had never questioned their relationship with Israeli technology companies suddenly began conducting internal audits of their defense systems. Nations that had welcomed Israeli agricultural advisors started demanding comprehensive background checks on foreign technical personnel. Governments that had proudly showcased their partnerships with Israeli cybersecurity firms quietly began seeking alternatives. But the most significant response came from an unexpected quarter: the technical professionals who had been unknowingly complicit in the surveillance operations. Within days of our evidence release, we began receiving anonymous messages from engineers, programmers, and technicians who had worked on Israeli projects across Africa. They provided additional documentation, technical specifications, and insider knowledge that filled gaps in our understanding of the operational scope. A software engineer from Mali sent us detailed schematics of backdoors built into voter registration systems. A telecommunications specialist from Senegal provided evidence of monitoring equipment installed in cellular tower infrastructure. A cybersecurity consultant from Kenya revealed how security assessments had actually been intelligence-gathering operations designed to map governmental vulnerabilities. These technical whistleblowers represented a new kind of resistance movement professionals with intimate knowledge of how modern surveillance systems operate, driven by conscience to expose the abuse of their expertise. Their contributions transformed our evidence collection from a reactive investigation into a proactive intelligence operation that could anticipate and counter future threats. The psychological impact on Israeli intelligence operations was immediate and severe. Operational security protocols that had relied on African ignorance of technical capabilities suddenly became liabilities. Personnel who had operated under light cover found themselves exposed and vulnerable. Communication networks that had seemed secure were revealed to be monitored and analyzed by their targets. But perhaps most damaging was the revelation of how systematic and coordinated these operations had been. The evidence we had assembled painted a picture not of isolated intelligence gathering, but of a comprehensive strategy to maintain technological dependence and prevent African technological sovereignty. Every partnership had been designed to create vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Every assistance program had included components that served Israeli intelligence interests. The economic implications extended far beyond the immediate contract cancellations. Israeli technology companies had built their African business models on the assumption that African governments lacked the technical sophistication to detect surveillance capabilities or the political will to reject them once some have discovered. Our actions had shattered both assumptions, creating a crisis of confidence that threatened their entire continental strategy. Stock prices for major Israeli defense contractors plummeted as investors recognized that their African revenue streams were no longer secure. International customers began demanding additional transparency and oversight for Israeli technology purchases. Military cooperation agreements that had been routine approvals became subjects of parliamentary debate and public scrutiny. The diplomatic consequences were equally severe. Israel's carefully cultivated image as a reliable partner for developing nations was replaced by suspicions about hidden surveillance capabilities and ulterior motives. African diplomatic personnel began avoiding Israeli technology in their communications. International conferences featuring Israeli participants found African delegates conspicuously absent from technical sessions. But the most profound impact was on the consciousness of African populations themselves. For generations, technological dependence had been accepted as natural, the assumption that advanced capabilities must come from more developed nations, that African countries should be grateful for whatever assistance they could receive. Our revelations challenged this fundamental assumption by demonstrating that technology transfers were often Trojan horses, designed to maintain rather than reduce dependence. The generational aspect of this awakening was particularly significant. Young Africans who had grown up with digital technology began questioning the origins and security of the platforms they used daily. University students studying computer science and engineering started demanding curricula that included technological sovereignty and security analysis. Entrepreneurs began exploring indigenous alternatives to foreign technology solutions. This intellectual ferment created fertile ground for the development of genuine African technological capabilities. Innovation hubs in Lagos, Nairobi, and Cairo began focusing on secure communication systems, independent software development, and hardware manufacturing that could operate free from foreign oversight. The brain drain that had traditionally sent Africa's best technical minds to Western institutions began reversing as opportunities for meaningful work in technological sovereignty emerged at home. The response from traditional imperial powers revealed how fundamentally our actions had disrupted established patterns of control. Western media outlets struggled to frame our revelations in ways that didn't implicate their own surveillance relationships with Israel. European governments found themselves awkwardly defending intelligence partnerships while claiming ignorance of operations against their supposed African partners. The United States faced particularly complex challenges, as their own extensive surveillance cooperation with Israel meant that American intelligence had likely benefited from the African operations we had exposed. Congressional hearings were quietly initiated to assess the extent of American knowledge about Israeli activities in Africa, while diplomatic channels worked frantically to contain the diplomatic damage. France's response was especially revealing, as their historical claims to special relationships with African nations were undermined by evidence that they had facilitated Israeli surveillance operations through shared intelligence networks. The revelation that French technical assistance programs had been used as cover for Israeli operations sparked angry confrontations in the French National Assembly and demands for investigations of intelligence service activities. But the most significant challenge to the established order came from the precedent we had set for technological resistance. Other nations facing similar surveillance pressures began adopting our methodologies for detecting and countering foreign intelligence operations. The playbook we had developed for technological sovereignty became a template that could be adapted to different contexts and threats. The Iranian government, long subject to intensive Israeli surveillance, requested detailed briefings on our counterintelligence techniques. Palestinian technical organizations sought assistance in detecting and neutralizing Israeli monitoring systems. Even European privacy advocates began studying our methods for identifying and exposing government surveillance capabilities. This diffusion of counter-surveillance knowledge represented a fundamental shift in the global balance of intelligence capabilities. For decades, sophisticated surveillance had been the exclusive domain of major powers, giving them decisive advantages in international relations. Our demonstration that these capabilities could be detected, analyzed, and countered by determined smaller nations challenged the entire foundation of intelligence-based imperial control. The training programs we established for other African governments became models for South-South technological cooperation that bypassed traditional North-South dependency relationships. Engineers from multiple African countries collaborated on developing indigenous surveillance detection systems. Intelligence professionals shared methodologies for analyzing foreign technical personnel and identifying potential surveillance operations. Perhaps most importantly, we began developing offensive capabilities that could turn surveillance systems against their operators. Rather than simply defending against Israeli intelligence gathering, we started gathering intelligence about Israeli operations that could be used to protect other potential targets and expose the broader scope of their activities. The success of these programs validated our fundamental argument that technological sovereignty was not just a defensive necessity, but an offensive capability that could reshape international power relationships. African nations working together could develop technical capabilities that rivaled those of traditional imperial powers, but oriented toward liberation rather than domination. The psychological transformation this created among African populations was profound and irreversible. The assumption that Africa must always be a consumer rather than producer of advanced technology was replaced by evidence that African innovation could create solutions specifically designed for African needs and values. Our journey from surveillance target to technological liberator had demonstrated that the choice between dignity and convenience was false. Authentic security could only come from indigenous capabilities, genuine partnerships with equals, and the rejection of technological relationships designed to maintain dependence. The dawn we had promised was no longer a metaphor but a measurable reality. The emergence of an Africa that could protect itself, control its own technological destiny, and offer alternatives to nations tired of surveillance disguised as cooperation. And as that dawn broke across the continent, it illuminated a future where sovereignty was not just a political concept, but a technological capability that could be built, defended, and shared among all peoples determined to be free.